Live in five, four.
Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for tonight's special live event. The Australian Psychedelic Society and I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. If you're not already, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of our Australian Psychedelic Society content. I'm Antonika Hoberg, and I'm the Australian Psychedelic Society Vice President, and I'll be hosting tonight's live panel. So stay with us for the panel, followed by an opportunity at the end for you to ask our panelists your own questions. And tonight's live panel discussion is about the recent announcement from the TGA that psilocybin and MDMA will be able to be prescribed by TGA-approved psychiatrists for the treatment of two specific mental health conditions from July 1st, 2023. Psilocybin and MDMA are now Schedule 8 controlled drugs in the poison standard when prescribed by TGA authorized psychiatrists for treatment-resistant depression and PTSD, respectively. They remain in Schedule 9 as prohibited substances when not prescribed for either of those two conditions. And this is the first time that any country in the world has recognized these two drugs as medicines. While the rescheduling will lead to a reduction in the stigmas associated with these substances, the Australian Psychedelic Society remains committed to decriminalisation and related reforms to remove the criminal penalties for possession and use of illicit drugs and working towards safer supply. With the medical community and public raising questions and concerns around this announcement, we bring you a team of experts and professionals to provide insights on the topic. Our panelists will bring a wealth of knowledge and expertise to the table. So please share this event with your friends right now so that they don't miss this opportunity to learn more about the implications of this TGA announcement and the role of this in the mental health treatments in Australia. And if they do miss out, never mind, because you'll be able to watch this later on YouTube anyway. I'd like to thank our panelists and partner organisations such as PRISM, EGA, The Patch and Enlighten Mental Health for their continuing contributions. Before we begin the Q&A, I will introduce you to this evening's panelist. Our first panelist is Dr. Sam Douglas, the Australian Psychedelic Society Vice President. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, Sam?
Sure. So as Antonika says, I'm president. I'm not sure why. People think it's a mark of something good. I think it's because I was the only person with enough ego and foolishness to take on the job. My background is in philosophy. Specifically, I teach professional ethics and critical thinking. But I've been involved with plant medicines and psychedelics in an unofficial, amateur way, probably for my whole adult life, as long as I can remember. So that's really my background and how I came to be here is a longer story than we've got time for.
Of course. Thanks a lot, Sam. All right. Dr. Steve Bright, would you like to go next?
Sure. So I'm a clinically trained psychologist. I currently am senior lecturer at Edith Cowan University. I coordinate the Bachelor of Health Sciences course in addiction studies and am the principal investigator and co-therapist for Australia's first trial of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, and a co-investigator and part of the therapy team for a trial of psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy for treatment-resistant depression, also occurring here in Perth, Western Australia.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. Nigel, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you, Antonika. I'm a psychiatrist with a special interest in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. I've been interested in non-ordinary states of consciousness for most of my career, and probably been in one for a while too. And I think that psychedelic drugs have a role to play in psychiatry, and I've been advocating for research into this area for some years, and we've been successful in recent years. And I'm now an investigator in 5 studies, some of which involve psilocybin, MDMA, 5-MeO, DMT, and ayahuasca. So I'm really interested in all of these substances and how they affect people from a clinical and personal point of view. I'm also chairperson of an unofficial group of psychiatrists who are interested in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, trying to officialise this work. The College of Psychiatrists has been somewhat reticent in accepting that we need to get on with this process and develop techniques, particularly in relation to the psychotherapeutic aspects of the use of these drugs, because from my point of view, and I think from most medical perspectives, it's not the drug, it's the psychotherapy that goes with the drug. The drug can have a profound effect, as you know, but the psychotherapy is also crucial. And psychiatry is a little bit distant these days from psychotherapy. And so in some ways, introducing psychedelics into psychiatry is trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. So there's all sorts of issues that are arising. It's an interesting time, very political, and I'm having a ball.
I'm so glad that you're having a ball, at least, within it all. It is, it's good fun. And I agree. I think there's definitely a place for psychotherapy in there, and it definitely needs to be looked in more. And I'm excited to see more come out. Would you like to go next, Pixie?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Pixie. I started an organization called The Patch, Psychedelically Aware Talking Circle Hub, and that was an opportunity for the community to come together and talk about psychedelics and how to approach being safer with them and choices being made. I also study neuroscience at the moment, so I've got a really keen interest in studying how psychedelics can be used in therapeutic models, and I was particularly interested, though, at the moment in the community response and what the community is seeking out of this decision.
Yeah, the community is definitely wanting some answers, and the Patch has been very vocal about it, and it's been awesome. Eternity, would you like to share a little bit about what you're up to?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm based in Perth. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Enlightened Mental Health. We're an online practice focusing on harm reduction and psychedelic integration. I'm also an executive advisor for Reset Mind Sciences here in Perth as well. I've got a background in psychology and politics and national security, and spent a number of years in the military. So I have a strong interest in ensuring that current and ex-serving veterans receive adequate mental health support. And I've got a real passion for bringing these substances into the wider population, which I think we can now safely call them medicines with the recent rescheduling, which is wonderful, in a safe and ethical manner. And I'm really passionate about building pathways forward for access to these substances. So really looking forward to the discussion tonight, and thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, everyone. Everyone's got something really valuable to share tonight, so I'm looking forward to what comes out. So to get us started, I'm going to turn over to Nigel Strauss, who will explain the details of the TGA decision and what they mean in practice. Feel free to go into a little bit more detail than I did initially, Nigel.
Well, the interesting thing, Antonika, isn't that there isn't a lot more detail. This has been a surprise decision that's come out of left field, and I'll express my views openly. I think lobbying's had a lot to do with this. I won't go into any details. Rather than research, one of the things I'm really interested in is good research. And as part of the research, we learn how to use these drugs clinically, not recreationally or in any other way, but this is a clinical process. And the research so far has been really interesting, and people are learning how to use these drugs as therapists, and issues like patient selection, who makes a good therapist, who doesn't make a good therapist. All these things come about from research using appropriate protocols. So there's safety, observation, and good supervision. So this decision's come out of left field after the research has begun, but I think personally a little bit prematurely, because we're not quite ready yet for this to happen from a medical point of view. I know there'll be a lot of opinions about that, but that's my opinion. And from the 1st of July, certain select psychiatrists will be able to prescribe these drugs under the authorised prescriber system, which is regulated by the TGA, the Therapeutic Goods Administration. And that means that they have to have a deep understanding of the conditions they're treating, and in this case, treatment-resistant depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. They have to have a good understanding of the needs of the patients they're treating, and they have to have a good understanding of the drugs that they're using. Now, as well as getting permission from the TGA, every time, at this stage anyway, and this is the plan, every time these drugs are to be prescribed by these select psychiatrists, there has to be an ethics committee protocol that's part of the process, which at this stage makes things a bit cumbersome. And we're not sure whether these select psychiatrists will only need to go through this process once or each time a patient is treated. Because if it's each time a patient is treated, it's going to be very cumbersome and difficult. It's at the moment, the drugs are Schedule 9, so they can only be used in research circumstances. And with the change, they'll be Schedule 8, which means that they can be used under the circumstances that I've just described. We don't know who's going to be selected. We don't know what sort of training will be necessary. We don't know who will do the training and what sort of accredited courses there will be. There are some courses available, but none of them have been accredited yet. And decisions on that, which are key, I think, have to be made. And we haven't got much time. That's what I said before. I've been pushing the College of Psychiatrists to get on with their job, and they've been a bit sleepy. But hopefully things will evolve quickly, and there's certainly a lot of discussion going on about it at the moment. It seems that the decision is a good one, and many of us have supported this change, but with the proviso that there's adequate training and a good understanding of who's qualified, who isn't qualified, what the qualifications mean. And I think they're the questions that remain unanswered, and we need to answer them pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's exactly right. May I ask, like you said that it was quite a quick snap sort of decision. Why do you think that they put it through so fast, knowing full well that psychiatry and the psychologists actually aren't ready and there is no adequate training yet?
I'm not sure. I do know that there have been active lobbying groups working hard to convince the TGA to change the scheduling, and it seems to me that they've been successful in their lobbying. So this is a surprising circumstance whereby lobbying has changed the scheduling. I don't think there's been a precedent for that. Normally we rely on research.
Yeah.
And in this particular case, there hasn't been enough research. There has been some research, and Rick Doblin over in the States with MDMA has done his 2 phase 3 studies, and it looks as if the FDA may change things eventually. But you know, the chickens escaped from the hatch, and no one's really quite sure why that change has occurred. And I don't think that the TGA has explained themselves satisfactorily. So we're left with all this surmising, and the only real conclusion is that lobbying has brought this about, and it's an extraordinary situation if that is the case.
Yeah, it's really it's taken a lot of people by surprise. So I'll ask you another question about that then. So who do you believe is going to get access to these therapies? Like what will be the eligible criteria? So I saw some conversation where people were talking about treatment-resistant, it being for treatment-resistant depression, but what constitutes treatment-resistant? How many therapies do you have you needed to have before you're allowed to try these substances and this therapy?
Look, I can't give you the exact numbers. Steve would probably know more about this than I would, but several courses of antidepressants and other treatments, all the treatments that are available, probably ECT and TMS, all those sorts of treatments should have been tried before the psilocybin can be used. Now, in my experience in the trials that I've been involved in with treating people with depression, it's a good way to start from a clinical perspective, but I'm wondering now from my own experience whether that's a good way to go, because what we're going to end up with is people with very severe depression who are being treated, whereas perhaps these drugs are more effective with people who have less severe depression, moderate depression. So it's a criteria that worries me, actually.
Because
they're the ones
to get low before they get the help.
Yeah, the severely depressed people. It works with research, but I don't know if it's going to work under these circumstances. And the other thing that really concerns me about that, in that light, is, you know, who's going to make those decisions as to, you know, whether people have severe untreatable depression? Is there a way around that? You know, if somebody gets permission to treat, can there be some sort of backdoor ways of getting people into the treatment? And of course, there's going to be the big issue, of course, is there's going to be huge financial pressure to treat as many people as possible, because the lobbying groups have convinced a lot of people that this is going to be a panacea. So there's a huge demand, and that demand is going to be fueled by the need that some people have to make a lot of money out of it. And all these sort of extra factors really concern me. And, you know, research could easily, I know you want to talk about this later, but research could easily be put on the back burner, as has happened with cannabis.
All right.
And we could get a similar model where, you know, it's a free for all and standards drop. I'm not saying that'll happen. Things will be rigid to begin with, but anything's possible, particularly when money's got something to do with it.
Yeah, of course. Do you want to add anything to that, Steve? Maybe?
Sorry, the technology doesn't always work. The funny thing is I didn't really have anything to add. I agree with everything that Nigel said. I think that there's not much time between now and the 1st of July. And with a decision like this, normally there would be a lot more of a lead-in time to be able to think about scaling up what we're already doing in research, to think about the implementation. So I think one of the concerns I have is that we're rushing to get to this point, and there's no clear blueprint or plan around how it's going to be implemented. There's no clinical guidelines. And so, you know, I think that's a bit of a concern. And also just the tail end of what Nigel was saying around the impact this is having on the broader community. I think on one hand, it's fantastic that Australia would be the first country in the world to recognise these as medicines. But on the other hand, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding within the broader community about what this actually means, how easy it's going to be for people to access. You know, I've had a number of clinicians contact me that are concerned about their patients who see this as some sort of holy grail because it has been sold to them as this panacea by that lobbying organisation that we won't name. And consequently, you know, they see that if they don't get into it, that they aren't able to access this now, then that's the end of the road for them. And I think that's a really unhelpful mindset to have, particularly when we know that these therapies don't work for everyone. And we don't know, for those people that they don't work, we don't know what are the factors that predict whether or not it works or not, because the research really hasn't been done yet. And so, you know, as Nigel was saying, it's very odd that we would sort of do something. We have government by lobbying rather than doing the research first, having all the evidence, and then developing a model for implementation based on the evidence.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
Can I just add to that? I agree with everything Steve's just said. Just want to say that unfortunately, with the promises that have been made about the supposed effectiveness of these drugs, there are a lot of people who, not being able to access them above ground, are accessing them underground. And most of the clinicians that I know who are interested in psychedelics are seeing a lot of casualties from these drugs being used by people who aren't using them properly. And that's another side effect, which is really catastrophic and awful, actually, unnecessary.
Yeah, well, that's the thing that's one of the things that's really concerning for a lot of people in the community is how many people are going to go and seek this out for themselves without the adequate, you know, setting and all of that sorted out before they go and try this substance, because, oh, look, doctors are doing it now, so it means it's fine. It means it's okay. So does that mean that we will not know like where these substances will be given? Like, so say for example, you have a psychiatrist, so that they like, where are they going to do these substances? Steve's shaking his head. No one knows. Where do you put someone for that amount of time while they're in a session?
The TGA talk about controlled medical settings, and there are a number of clinics that are being set up at the moment where the people who own those clinics are proposing to use these drugs. They're already using ketamine, and they want to jump straight into psilocybin and MDMA. How they're going to do it and who's going to do it and what standards they're going to try and achieve, we don't know. And that's the concerning thing.
Yeah, it sounds like it's going to be a lot of just making it up as they go. So that brings me to my next question, and I might direct this more towards Eternity, and anyone else can jump in afterwards. But where are these medicines going to come from? Where will the psilocybin, where will the MDMA come from?
So there's a number of places that the substances will be sourced from and are already being sourced from. So for example, the MDMA trial that Steve mentioned earlier, I believe that MDMA is being sourced from MAPS, and usually in Australia it is being sourced from MAPS. The psilocybin for various trials is usually sourced from overseas from a company called Usona, and they're based in Canada, and it is synthetic as well. I think it's probably important to mention as well that Reset Mind Sciences has the first licenses in Australia to grow magic mushrooms, which is really exciting. And they've got a custom-built grow room that's in the final commissioning stages. And so Australia is going to have, naturally grown psilocybin-containing mushrooms, which is really, really exciting. So.
Awesome. Okay, so then that brings me to how much is it going to cost? So like how much are we expecting a session with a psychiatrist? So a lot of us already aren't able to get in to see psychiatrists and psychologists, and some of them have 12-month wait lists. How are we going to pay for this? What sort of costs are we looking at?
Absolutely. I mean, there are definitely going to be broader accessibility issues, and I've heard a few numbers thrown out recently in the past week since this announcement's come out, in excess of $20,000 for, I think it's per session. And so I just want to acknowledge that this is a really, really important issue, and it's going to be a multi-year, multi-tier solution. And to be honest, we don't know exactly what the way forward will be at this stage, but it is expensive, and those expenses are made up of psychiatrist costs, psychologist costs, because I think it's important to mention that it's not just the medicines that are doing the work. There's got to be therapists there, and then follow up as well with psychologists. And so there's also hospital costs, doctors, etc., machines, all of those things to make sure that you're safe if you're the patient, because of course we want to ensure like safety is the number one priority. And I think from the very beginning in these early stages now, it's really important to engage with the private health providers as soon as possible. I also think it's really important that DVA, and it's exciting, I mean, and I don't know what's going to happen in this space, but it's promising that DVA and the Australian Defence Force are already paying for ketamine treatments for a number of current and ex-serving Defence Force members. And so if we walk down that train of thought, there is a possibility there. And of course, I don't speak for the Defence Force or TVA, but the possibility there that veterans may be covered under that scheme. And then, of course, the speed at which this issue can be resolved really depends on a number of frameworks that we operate within. And I think we need to acknowledge that we do work within the Australian healthcare model, and we do need to work with private health providers, Medicare, and other providers as well, including DVA, NDIS, and the Australian Defence Force, to try and subsidise these costs as much as we can and make them accessible to more people in the community. But I don't think this is going to be something that's going to be accessible or affordable to many, many people. And I heard Steve say this the other day, I think on another panel you're on, Steve. The people who need this the most are the most vulnerable, and often they may not fall under DVA, they may not fall under the NDIS or any of these places that will potentially cover these costs. And so that is absolutely an issue that we need to tackle.
It absolutely is. Yeah. Personally, I had treatment-resistant depression, and there's no way I could have afforded that. And yeah, it's just not feasible for so many people who actually need it. And so I'll be really interested to see how it unfolds as time goes by.
I mean, it's really interesting because there's this hype out there in the media and a misunderstanding of, hey, now these medicines are going to be accessible. And it's like, well, actually, they're not, because in order for authorised prescribers to prescribe them, first of all, they need to be an authorised prescriber, and then they need higher research ethics committee approval. And often that comes through a clinical trial. And so it's looking as though patients will only be able to access these medicines within a clinical trial. And I think Steve and Nigel will probably talk a lot more to that. But for those people, it's offered this glimmer of hope. But then in some ways it's been taken away, because unless you meet the very specific criteria of the clinical trial and what it's looking at, whether it's a particular type of depression or PTSD, then those people are still going to be waiting. And so there's not really a lot of changes going to happen for the broader community with this rescheduling from the TGA.
Yeah, definitely. So how long so we know that it took a while for them to figure out how they were going to prescribe cannabis and all of that. So how long will the process take from the time that we say someone comes in to see you, Steve or Nigel, and is like, I want psychedelic therapy? How long are we expecting that process to take? Either or.
You mean from the time that and we don't know whether each patient, as I said before, needs to make an application, and the psychiatrist will need to make an application, and then once that's accepted, they'll have to go through a ethics committee. It could be a very cumbersome process, but to be perfectly honest, I think that would be a good thing for a little while until we develop these other systems, which is, who are the people who can prescribe these drugs? How are we going to set up multidisciplinary teams? Because, psychiatrists are more expensive than psychologists. That's just the reality. And I don't think there's necessarily going to be a lot of psychiatrists who want to do a lot of dosing. There might be, but I think from my own experience, there's a lot of psychologists who are much more in touch with psychotherapy, who will want to do the dosing. And so we've got to set up all these teams and under the supervision perhaps of a psychiatrist. But how much knowledge should the psychiatrist have? Should the psychiatrist be involved in dosing for a while as part of the training? I've written some clinical guidelines which I've spread around, and hopefully they can be a good start to all this process. But there are so many unanswered questions, Antonika, that it's impossible to answer that. I think to answer it quickly, though, it could take 6 months.
Yeah, right. Do you think that, this is just a psychiatry and for my own interest, do you think that eventually, given that psychedelics is such like it's a mind-altering experience, and psychiatry is all about the mind and the brain, and do you think that will become part of the education of future psychiatrists?
It's a big ask.
Down the track, just as included?
Well, I hope it does. And that's one of my interests in this, because I'm really interested in psychedelics, but I'm also interested in psychotherapy. And psychiatry's moved further and further away from the psychotherapeutic model, as many people know, into a sort of biomedical, hey, take this, or have a bit of an electric shock, or have a bit of a magnet, those sorts of treatments. Not every psychiatrist. There's some bloody good ones out there who are good psychotherapists. I don't want to generalize too much. But I think that's the definition of psychiatry has become that. And I think the definition of psychiatry, as it was last century, should include psychotherapy, because in any therapeutic relationship, it's the relationship that's the key, not the drug or the cognitive technique. It's the sort of relationship you form. And I think that's a key in this psychedelic work. So I would like to see psychedelics encourage psychiatry to become more psychotherapeutically orientated. And I think what psychiatry's got to offer psychedelics is an ethical approach, which is what psychiatry is all about: do no harm, those sorts of things. But the art of psychiatry, which is all about psychotherapy, is something that's not very powerful at the moment. And hopefully, with this psychedelic movement, that can be the change that psychiatry sees. I'm not that optimistic at the moment, but the new generation of psychiatrists are becoming more interested in psychedelics and more interested in psychotherapy. So one has to remain a little bit optimistic.
Well, I like your optimism.
I feel like one of the possible optimistic outcomes of all of this is that it might bring psychiatry and psychology together. Nigel was talking about the need for multidisciplinary teams, and this is quite different to other treatments that the TGA has approved. But I do hold hope that this will start to bring psychiatry and psychology together to be able to work better together. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I can see how that all sort of flows together, but it could almost be like a remarrying of the two disciplines and be cute together again. But I want to talk a little bit about what this means for those who are non-prescribed, non-prescription use of psychedelics. So this might be directed more at yourself, Sam, and maybe Pixie. What does this mean for the underground world? What does this mean for non-prescription use of psychedelics?
Well, there's a couple of ways to answer that. In the strictest legal sense, what it means is absolutely nothing. So just to be really, really super clear with everyone, and like we'd said earlier, this is a conversation we're going to be having a lot in coming months and years. Everything about psychedelics outside of these very narrow definitions that the TGA has set remains super illegal. So in that sense, no, it's not going to make any difference to, you know, the legal outcomes. When if police pull you over and you have a bootload of mushrooms that you've just picked, you're still going to be in trouble. You know, if a sniffer dog indicates on you at a festival and you've got a couple of pills in your pocket that may or may not be MDMA, you're still in trouble. So it's really, really important to be really clear about this, that this is, this change is very specific and doesn't apply to these broad areas. Other things that might change about what does it mean for non-prescription use? Well, look, I think there's likely to be flow-on effects in underground settings. And I think some of us who watch the scene and observe and keep an eye on things will have already seen changes in how people talk about this, how some, underground practitioners talk about this. I think, look, I stand by my statement that I made earlier when I heard about this, is that the war on drugs in Australia isn't over. It just got more profitable. I think that's the case. There'll be an increase in demand, and increase in demand means that all of this is going to cost more. So what you're probably going to see is underground facilitators and people in that underground illicit side of things are just going to charge more. That's probably the main upshot that we're going to see.
While still facing the same prosecution potentially.
Well, yes, while still facing the same, and everyone involved still faces the same prosecution, because all of the possession and use and all of the things that go with that, they're all still illegal and won't have changed under any of the state laws, and none of the other federal laws that about serious drug offences. None of them have changed. So yeah, that's
that's where you see it going. How about you, Pixie? Have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, this is something I've definitely been witnessing myself, that there's been a massive shift in the public where there's a lot more interest, and so a lot more people coming through who are DIY or who are seeking out underground therapies. And unfortunately, we started the harm reduction org because of the trail of carnage that can come with that. And that's not to say at all that psychedelic medicines aren't safe and effective when used in a proper fashion, and it's not even to say that underground practices can't have any benefits, but it's the Wild West, and so people are actually already talking about putting their prices up, or already have. And you're seeing a lot of this kind of like bootlegging almost, where people are doing a makeshift kind of therapy even though they don't actually have the qualifications. And so just kind of self-appointing. Of course there's going to be problems involved in this, and now that it's gone through for a few things, for other conditions and for the vast majority of people who will be locked out because it's just too expensive, they're all going to be funneled through to this underground market. And we're not prepared for that, and it's not going to change just because even if we tried to put the cat back in the bag, it wouldn't work, because the media has been covering it so much. There is this hyper focus, and the other side of that is that like hope and that last resort. So if they go to someone and it doesn't work out in underground therapy, or even if they go to someone because they can afford it with above ground therapy, and it doesn't work out for them, or it doesn't work out quickly enough, I really, really worry about the letdown and the crushing that has, because I've seen that before as well. Yeah,
I agree. I've been watching the same things as you, and I see the same things planning out, and people putting their prices up, and there's as much damage as much good can be done from the underground and above ground as well. But this brings me to ask about this is more of a broad question to everyone. Don't all answer at once, but what sort of training do we want these psychiatrists, psychologists, and even underground facilitators, from your perspective, Pixie and Sam? What sort of training would we ideally want these therapists to go through to be able to do this safely? Steve?
I think that I've got in my mind a bit of a curly question, just because we've talked about sort of the underground scene, and I think while it can be a little bit like an experience in dosing these drugs and providing preparation and integration. And so I think it's quite unfortunate that many of those individuals will be excluded from this. I'm not sure how, particularly in Australia where we're quite conservative, how some of that knowledge is going to be brought into training the above ground. But I feel like that's one of the curly questions that's being thrown around in some of the circles that I'm part of at the moment. I think that it will be, at least at first, APRA recognised clinicians, so psychologists, possibly social workers, working with psychiatrists. In terms of the training then of those clinicians, there is no best practice model at the moment, but there are some pretty good examples. And I will stand by the MAPS training as a good example of how you train clinicians with, lots and lots and lots of hours of video footage that they've been able to capture, running the training over 5-6 days, 12-hour sessions. And basically we were told that if you can't sit still for 12 hours, you're probably not right for this, because you're going to be sitting with people for a long time. And of course, they've had the experiential component to it as well. And I think that will be essential, is ensuring somehow in Australia, with all of the conservatism that I just mentioned, that the clinicians working in this field are able to access a psychedelic experience themselves, to get a better idea of what it is that the person's going through when they're having their psychedelic experience.
Do we think that these therapists will be required to have their own psychedelic experiences? I know that's been discussed before, whether you want to sit with someone who's never had an experience before, but will these therapists been through that? They can't disclose.
I don't think they will at the start, because Australia is quite conservative. Of course, as Nigel said, and I'll just reiterate, the devil's in the detail, and there's really no detail at the moment as to what the training might look like. We've talked about these models of psychotherapy with a psychiatrist involved and a psychotherapy team working together, but that's just our thinking as to what's going to work practically from a financial perspective, what would be best for the patient as well. But at the moment, none of those details have been laid out. I mean, the term psychotherapy is only mentioned once or twice in the entire TGA document that was released.
Yeah.
Can I have a word about that? I agree with everything Steve said. There's a lot of nuance too, and you only pick that up when you're actually doing the work. And I've been involved as a therapist in 2 trials, and I think it's essential that the therapist has a psychedelic experience. I cannot imagine. It's not like any other psychiatric tablet. You don't have to take an antidepressant to prescribe an antidepressant. But I really do think if you're going to sit there for 6 to 8 hours with someone who's taken psilocybin and you've never taken it yourself, you have no idea what's going on. You don't anyway have any idea what's going most of the time, but you can imagine what's going on because you've been through it yourself. And I'm starting to think that the therapists should have that experience, and they should be able to gain something from it. They may need to have several experiences, but to get to a point where they're comfortable with their own psychedelic experience. Because if you have a therapist who's not comfortable with their own psychedelic experience, I wonder whether they're going to be suitable to treat people who have challenging experiences themselves. I'm being a bit radical here, but I really believe, and I'm a very naughty psychiatrist because I sometimes equate shamanism with psychiatry, and in fact, that's where psychiatry came from. And I think we have to, in a way, think along those lines, even though I've been warned never to use that word, and I'll probably get deregistered for talking along these lines. But what we're doing here is taking people to a non-ordinary state of consciousness in which they're seeing things that they may never have imagined before, and they have spiritual experiences. I had someone we dosed on Monday who had profound experience. We didn't know what was going on until he told us at the end, but he said he saw God on several occasions. He didn't describe God, but I was keen to find out what he or she looked like. But anyway, I never found that out. But I'm being a bit flippant. But this person had a profound change. It seems to me that in order to be a good therapist in this field, you have to sort of know about all that stuff. Sam's a philosopher, and he studied all this sort of business. And I think really it takes you out of the realms of normal biomedical psychiatry. You've got to understand a bit about theology and philosophy and sociology, and all those things become really relevant. Alan Watts talked about it broadly, and I think that we need to understand all that wisdom if we're going to be good psychedelic psychotherapists. I'm getting a bit off track here, I know, but
no, it's great.
Those sorts of things are really, really relevant. And then who are the patients? We've had patients who have had mystical experiences and don't know what to do with them. They're just not constitutionally equipped to cope with those profound experiences. So it's not a waste of time, but it doesn't have the healing effect that you hope it does. So therefore, selection of patients is another big issue. Who are the people that you might select for this work? And on it goes. You know, these are subtle, nuanced things that really are a long way away from psychiatry when you think about it, probably closer to psychology. Steve might agree. And Sam, who's a philosopher, would understand that too, I think. So it's a huge, broad area, and it's so different in its breadth from normal psychiatric treatment that, you know, this is where I come from when I say, gee, are we really ready for this? And who's going to be doing this treatment and all these things, you know, bit frustrating.
Yeah, it definitely is. Pixie, would you like to? Oh, sorry, Eternity.
No, that's okay.
I know Pixie wanted to talk before.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Pixie. You've got a bit of a different perspective coming from the community and knowing what the community is like in our immediate psychedelic community. What sort of training are they wanting from facilitators?
Well, yeah, I guess like everything in this, it's a bit multifaceted. So some people will still preference going to the underground anyway because they can have a more relaxed model. They can have more buy-in about like the set and settings of where they're doing it. For example, some people would prefer to do this in nature rather than in a clinical environment, and that has come up a lot. But in terms of training, I mean, some of this very much overlaps for above ground, underground anyway. But I have to say that unless we're misreading the landscape, the general feedback is that a lot of this hasn't been followed or hasn't happened for the underground. That's not to say that none have, but they'd like a basic first aid and CPR straight up. That has come up so many times over now. People want to have confidence that if there's a problem, that even though it's illegal, that an ambulance will be called. They'd like them to be trauma informed. I was actually surprised by how much that came up, the lack thereof, and that you've got a lot of people attracted to this because of trauma history. And so the lack of trauma informed training for facilitators, that's something we'd like to see change. And then you've got mental health first aid that isn't usually accomplished, and again, would be great. And so you've got to manage both the risks in terms of the physical and the psychological. My undergrad was actually health science and psychology, so this is where I think we need those interdisciplinary approaches to manage care, whether it's above ground or underground. But you also have to consider the fact that these are profoundly mind altering. And I mean, when you're addressing mental health issues, the mind is something we want to alter. Like, that's the point. It has a problem, we want to alter it, but it's very malleable. And so it needs to be done in a very careful and considered way. And so just having some training around the actual physical, psychological, like how to help someone through a difficult trip, which is again where I think not only should therapists maybe have an experience with this, but they should be looking to the entheogenic community to actually get some feedback and some input on this, because really there's so much of a wealth of knowledge there to be tapped on what people have experienced, what has worked, what hasn't worked. And while that might be different from one person to another, there's still already a huge amount of data there just waiting to be benefited from. But it has to be a flexibility and not just seeing things through a traditionally clinical perspective, but being a little bit more open-minded to a broader context.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you, Pixie, Steve, and Nigel. Do you want to add to that, Eternity?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just wanted to say that was such a big question. There's so much we've expanded. Safety. I think when we're talking about training and we're talking about the underground, there's limited training and there's limited safety protocols, if any. You know, just being someone in this space who hears a lot of stories and observes a lot of things as well, there are people who've been put in some really unsafe situations, and as Pixie said, you know, ambulances sometimes aren't called. And so I just wanted to talk about, yeah, safety and efficacy and setting is really, really important in the underground for those people who are going to choose to go and use these substances. But in terms of training, I think it's likely that the training will be coming from clinical trials. And just to be clear, there's no accredited training out there. And Nigel, please correct me if I'm wrong, but if you see any training courses out, there's absolutely no accredited training in Australia at this point. And so it's likely that the clinical trials will use what they've developed and the protocols to develop the training. And we're just not at that stage yet. So those therapists who are in the trials and have that experience and have faced those challenging situations, for example, what to do when the trauma comes up during the psychedelic experience, what to do when they're faced with the anger and the tears, and being okay with that. And those therapists are the ones who are going to be able to test and adjust and then write the clinical protocols in consultation with the psychiatrists, of course, to come up with what's going to work the best. And so I think it's unlikely that there's going to be a lot of courses popping up that are really going to be at the standard that's appropriate. And so I just urge anyone to be wary of courses of that nature, because we haven't got through the trials yet. We're not there yet. But of course, trials are in the works, which is very exciting, but this is going to be a long process, and we do need to test and adjust. And of course, everything that health practitioners do needs to be evidence-based. And so to have various different therapy protocols or training, it's going to take a long time until they're accredited. And so, yeah, that's all I wanted to say as well, is that the people in the underground, there are counsellors, there are social workers, there are therapists who are working in the underground space. But then if you're looking to seek access to these treatments in a clinical space, in a clinical trial, then it's a long road ahead. I hate to be a downer, but it's a long road ahead to ensure that safety is at the forefront of our mind. And we're going to be looking at the efficacy of what comes out of the clinical trials and then trying to relate that to real world models. And unfortunately, being a downer again, this is not going to work for everybody. And going back to what Nigel said earlier, you know, perhaps we will alter the way that we look at this in the future, and it won't be those who are the most treatment resistant and have to try all of these other things as it is now. Maybe we'll need to give access to people whose symptoms are at sort of a lower level before they become high risk. But we're not quite there yet. And I think that's probably Nigel's area of expertise, not mine.
Yeah. Sorry, Nigel.
Can I just say, I think the other thing about the training that we must remember is that, like in medicine and psychology, you learn by doing. And the dyad system is good. When I say the dyad system, for those who don't know, we usually, at the moment in research, we have two therapists, generally a male and a female. And that helps with transference issues, I think. But one of the ways that we're teaching people is to go in with someone who's got experience in this area as a beginner, and that's the way to do it. Feel comfortable in that dyad and learn how to do it with someone else. And I think that's going to be the key to training. There's been a few courses around that are very expensive in which you go and learn the theory, but as I said to someone, you wouldn't want to go and have your appendix removed by a doctor who's only read about it and never done it. And in the same sense, I think that it's really important to learn from someone who's experienced. Now, the cost issue, just to go back to that, look, we're very limited with protocols at the moment because there's got to be a dyad and there's got to be 3 dosings and there's got to be this number of integration sessions and so on. But ultimately, back if I look back to the 60s and 70s, where you could take on groups, you could have 10 people coming in and having a psilocybin session, which would be much more economically orientated. Now, I don't know, I know Eternity is more interested in PTSD and MDMA, and we have to separate those two treatment modalities. There's much more active work to be done by the therapist in a PTSD MDMA session, because you have to direct the patients into the trauma, and they have to process the trauma under those circumstances, assisted by the MDMA. Whereas in the psilocybin treatment, it's less active, and people do their own work. We talk about self-healing. But I think ultimately, we will be able to have groups, and we may not need dyads. And so it can become more economic. Just one other thing, I'd love to be able to treat people in my little cottage down in the mountains in the forest. And that's my aim eventually, because really nature's all part of this. The clinical thing is great, but again, when you're getting into a psychedelic state, that's when you really want to be in nature. And I think those of us who have experienced psychedelic trips and so forth know what nature, how important nature is. So all these things have to be taken into account, but it's a long-term process.
Yeah, definitely. It definitely is a very long-term process. I can sort of imagine that sort of stuff will, in the next 15 to 20 years eventuate. It's going to be such a long thing that I'll probably finish my degree by then. Okay, let's go on further to what this might mean for research going forward. I think, I can't remember, it was someone mentioned before that it means that some research might stall, or somebody mentioned something about that, about the research component, how it would affect funding.
Nigel brought it up in some conversation earlier, and linked it to what we saw with medical cannabis, and I can sort of provide an anecdote around this. When I moved back to Perth in 2017, I went to a forum with the AMA around prescribing a medical cannabis, and they were really pushing back on any further down scheduling of THC, which I thought was crazy at the time, because I'm a drug policy reform advocate, so that didn't make sense. But their rationale was that if you can just go to a GP and get medical cannabis, why would you want to participate in a clinical trial and potentially be allocated to a placebo condition? And so I actually do understand where that's coming from now. So there's less motivation for people to participate if they can access the treatments in the broader community. Obviously, cost is still going to be a big motivating factor, because when you participate in a clinical trial, of course, the treatment is provided for free, and you're made sure that any cost to the participant, they're able to recoup that cost. I think the other issue, though, is, and I think this is with medical cannabis as well, I think there's less likely to be funding for research when the treatments are already widely available.
Yeah, why would they fund that? That doesn't make any sense. Yeah, I can see how that, which would limit, being able to do studies on perhaps people who aren't so depressed and would benefit from it earlier on. Oh, it's such a complex issue, isn't it? Does anyone else want to add anything to that before we move on?
I do think we do need to watch for vested interest. As this has opened up, there's going to be a big flocking of biopharmaceutical tech startups who are already in, particularly the cannabis pharmaceutical companies are the main ones looking to move over, and that makes sense. But it's just what they bring to the table, and I'm really hoping that goes well. But it's whether or not they'll use that power to lobby against decriminalization. It's whether or not they keep these patents and make lots of money while keeping it out of reach from other people, those sorts of things. So we really do need to pay attention to those vested interests.
And the other thing, I agree with Pixie on that. The real worry is that those companies are much more interested in the drug than the psychotherapy. I mean, the less psychotherapy, the cheaper it's going to be, and there'll be that pumping through feeling that comes, and that could be a really bad outcome in all of this.
It absolutely could be. Whilst we're touching a little bit on how that might impact decriminalisation and legalisation efforts, Sam, do you want to talk a little bit about what you think the impact of this will have on decrim and legalisation?
Yeah, this is a complex question to answer. So in some ways, I think there is a risk, a lot of people have talked about a risk that there's, I guess, because the medicalisation either encourages a sense of complacency, a sense of it's inevitable now. This is a thing that I hear a lot from people in the US. And because they went through this process in a lot of the West Coast states where you had medical cannabis, and then there was, 5, 10, 15 years later, in California or Oregon, you can just walk into a shop and buy some weed, essentially. And a lot of that is attributed to the fact that they had medicinal cannabis there before all of this happened. So there's this presented as this thing that's inevitable. Once these things are medicalized, it's inevitable that broader reform will happen, which I think is just plain wrong. Because if that was the case, then I'd just be able to pop down to my local ketamine dispensary, or just go to the pharmacy and pick up some cocaine or something. Like it's just it's not inevitable. And anyone who's familiar with medical cannabis in Australia will also tell you that it's really not inevitable, because we have medicinal cannabis. We have a medicinal cannabis system which is very carefully constructed to never ever lead to recreational legalization. In my opinion. So I think there's that sort of, I don't want people to feel, I would worry about people feeling like it's inevitable. I also think that, to pick up on Pixie's point, I think I think some businesses feel that there's a financial incentive to oppose decriminalisation or legalisation, because in their minds, I think, and this is probably at least partially true, like prohibition creates scarcity, essentially. Like, psilocybin is illegal, it's Schedule 9. That makes it really a scarce thing. Reality is that physically in Australia, psilocybin's not scarce, right? Like, every autumn, winter, every mushroom season in Victoria, how many tons of psilocybin mushrooms just literally popping out of the ground? How many? I asked.
How many, Sam? You did ask.
I asked my mycologist friend Kane Barlow this afternoon, and he hasn't replied yet. But like, it could be tons, literally tons of mushrooms, like across say Victoria in over winter, which equates to what like at the very least kilos of psilocybin if you were to extract, like, and that's like, I don't know, that's tens of thousands, probably. I don't know. I tried to do a back of the envelope calculation this afternoon. That's maybe 60,000 standard doses of psilocybin, pop out of the ground in Victoria every year if it's wet enough. Like, psilocybin is not actually scarce, but prohibition creates this scarcity, and scarcity is very profitable. So the point is that companies are going to want to maintain this, because, like, isn't it? Why would I pay a psychiatrist $15,000 when it's legal for me to go and pick some mushrooms? That's the way that they are seeing this kind of zero-sum game scarcity mindset, where so that's the real danger, is that I see, is that from a commercial point of view, and we've seen this because in the there's an inquiry going on at the moment, a federal inquiry from a joint law committee. So it's a committee from both houses that's talking about Australia's illicit drug problem. Mm-hmm. And one of the terms of reference was around decriminalisation and the strengths and weaknesses of that. And as you know, the APS put in our submission about this, along with many other organisations, and the submissions arguing against decriminalisation and drug law reform, there weren't many of them. And two of them were from cannabis industry bodies who actually actively argued against. Well, actually, one was from a cannabis business, but one was from a supposed cannabis business organisation actually argued against drug law reform. And so my worry is that we're going to see more of this with the heavily big money vested interests saying and literally using one of them. I have to go and find it, and I'm not going to say who, even though it's on the public record, but they literally talk about the need for the government to protect the cannabis industry from reform. And this is like what I really, really think that we could see from some businesses. They'll lobby the government to protect the business, the industry, i.e. their profits, from further reform. On the upside, since this happened, I've been in contact with a lot of businesses around the world, particularly in Canada, just people I know, and there's a lot of sort of the smaller to medium pharmaceutical companies in the field that really support decriminalisation. So, maybe it won't be that bad, but I haven't heard any of that talk from many Australian companies. Not that there's many of them, but some of them, who I won't name, do studiously avoid ever mentioning anything to do with drug law reform, or that their products or that their analogs that they're developing would ever be used in any situation other than strictly clinical. So yeah, I think there is a worry that it could limit that. On the upside, like people are talking about it, it really feels like the right time to push hard for reform, because you know what, if it's you know, you can't kind of go on claim, you know, we're going to talk about the safety profile of these things, then, you know, yeah, it seems like it's a good time to bring the conversation up and
sure does.
go with it.
And that's what the APS is aiming for, isn't it, Sam? Tikrim,
Yes.
We got this, you guys. All right, so I'm going to move on to our audience questions now. We've got half an hour left before we leave, so we'll just try and get in as many as possible. There is a couple of them, so I'm just going to work my way through the list. Okay, so if you want to answer this, put your hand up and I will choose you. Is there a desire to administer psilocybin to patients in a setting they feel comfortable in, e.g. their home, rather than a clinical setting that is foreign to many who would benefit from the therapy? We kind of covered this already in the, you know, like wanting to do it in, you know, nature and that sort of thing. But do we imagine that that's something that we would be able to have one day, a psychiatrist come and dose and then the therapist come and sit with you in your home environment?
Can I say that's already happened in one of the trials where a fellow was unable to leave his home because of illness, and he was dosed in his home, which I think he found much more comforting. So yes, the answer to that is yes, and I think that in years to come that will be an approach, but probably there'll be centres in the country which are adapted to it, where you can, you know, in beautiful environments where this treatment can be carried out.
Sounds lovely. I want to go there. Okay, so someone said, thank you for putting this together. I'm very interested in the use of psychedelics for treating PTSD, CPTSD, depression and anxiety. It's great to see us heading in the right direction. That was more of a thank you. Thanks, Nick, for that question. Okay, is there research on whether recreational usage of MDMA, psilocybin forms a protective factor for mood and anxiety disorders? That's probably more directed to the doctors of the house.
I didn't quite catch all of the question,
Do you want me to read it
I guess the first thing I think of when I'm asked a question similar to this is that, as Nigel said, and I guess I've reiterated, it's not just about the drug, it's about the psychotherapy. If these drugs were healing, you know, if these drugs on their own had healing properties, then all of the folks that go out to a festival and take some pills would be cured of their PTSD, and that's simply not happening. Similarly, if people have got depression and, you know, they've gone out to, you know, taken some mushrooms, generally that doesn't happen. So I don't think there's much good evidence that use of these in a recreational context has therapeutic outcomes, but there are, of course, anecdotal outliers, and I've heard a number of cases, particularly with adults with autism who also experience social anxiety, who have actually got a therapeutic experience using MDMA recreationally. And I think that's because the use of MDMA recreationally almost mimics what we would do with those particular individuals with the therapy, in that we expose them to social situations to help them habituate and you know, have positive experiences of socializing. So of course, if you take MDMA at a festival, you're probably going to have a positive social experience, and that in and of itself can be therapeutic.
Yeah, I have heard of that. I have a friend who did that very thing, and it works. It worked for them. Yeah, doesn't work for everyone. Just reiterating that fact. Okay. Does TGA approved MDMA exist?
Yeah, well, yes and no, in that the way this legislation is working is similar to the cannabis legislation. So there's no approved, you know, medical cannabis product, but through the special access scheme, people are able to prescribe products that aren't you know, approved products by the TGA. And so I've spoken to a lot of different people about this to try to get an understanding of what the minimum standard would be to import, you know, a Schedule 8 MDMA or psilocybin into Australia, and it's not even clear whether it needs to be GMP, which is a particular manufacturing quality standard. So I actually don't know the answer, and the best minds I've spoken to don't really know the answer to what will constitute the minimum requirement for it to be considered appropriate to import within this new TGA change.
So interesting how much no one knows about the change that they brought in so suddenly. Yeah. Okay, so and how can those qualifications, those referred to be Nigel, the prerequisite qualifications. Okay, this question's broken up. Hang on, sorry guys. How can those qualifications be communicated to potential consumers? How can qualifications be communicated? I'm not really understanding that question, so we're just going to move on to that one. Sorry, Alex.
Sorry,
Antonika, I think I get.
Oh, you know this one.
I know this one. So I think I understand this one. So if, I think this is like a question about if, given that psychiatrists aren't going to be able to advertise that they prescribe these medicines, so how would you even like you have to, those qualifications, how are you going to know how are you going to know who can prescribe, and even if they can prescribe, how are you going to how are consumers going to know what qualifications that they could or should have?
Right, because they've just also mentioned in the rescheduling that you aren't able to advertise that you're able to give therapy and so you can't advertise. So yeah, how will people know?
I mean, strictly speaking, you're not supposed to advertise that you prescribe cannabis, but but I mean, that's I think that is the question. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well. Yeah, well, I mean, I think word of mouth's a very rapid traveller, and I think that'll be the way. But again, we don't know. I think there'll probably be some sort of registry eventually of people who can do it, and that should be accessible. We hope that the Royal College of Psychiatrists comes on board and assists us with this, because they've got all the infrastructure, and if we work with them, those sort of problems can be solved. Yeah.
Okay. Another question is, who has lobbied for this so successfully? Do we know who lobbied for this?
I'll put since I've put myself out publicly in the past, I'm happy to throw myself under the bus here and just be explicit and say it was My Medicine Australia.
Okay. Yep. They did well. They lobbied real well.
I don't think they were alone in it.
No, there's probably a lot of other stories.
Yeah, I think it's important to note as well that there's a lot of other players in this space as well, including the APS, who put forward their own submission to the TGA rescheduling, multiple doctors, multiple psychiatrists, and multiple organisations. And so I think it's been a real community effort across the psychedelic space. And not everybody else has been as loud about it as well, but those other people and organisations who have contributed, I think they really deserve some acknowledgement here as well.
That was a very nice answer, Tony.
I think there has been a lot of different kinds of people in the mix lobbying at this stage in the game, and that's not always talked about because a lot of focus does go into one group or one entity or another. But yeah, while My Medicine Australia have taken credit for it, for example, Entheogenesis Australis have been around for well over a decade. They were kicking around back in the early 2000s and have been working at this for that long. But then you've also got a couple of pharmaceutical companies who have some mining friends who put money into it as well. And I'm sure that they also have friends in good places and things like that as well. We have no idea what kinds of internal professional connections may have been involved, because it really wasn't very long ago that they said our decision is no. Yeah. And then out of the blue, they turn around and say, hey, surprise, you can have it. And it was like, what? So there was clearly something going on in the background, and I just think it's important to acknowledge that this really not only wasn't one entity or player, but there was people with different motivations in lobbying for this decision.
Yeah, absolutely. Just very different. Yeah, I would agree with you.
I lived in Canberra for the past 11 years before recently moving to Perth, and I've worked with a lot of people in the public service, and I do like to think that there are a lot of progressive people working at the TGA. So we're just going to put that one out there.
I like it. Okay, so my next question. Would the creation of an education centre here in Australia that specialises in psychedelics and associated therapies be a good idea to bring together all of the research going around in the world? Thanks, Ang.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think the answer to that is definitely yes. And at the moment, there are various groups being formed, and I'm hoping that these groups will coalesce so that we can all work together and not set up different competitive groups. I think we need to work together on this and put our energy into the same direction. I think once the politics and the lobbying settles down, hopefully we can do that. But I think that very much depends on the money side of things too. There may be people who don't want us to do that because they want to corner the market or they want to have their own clinics or whatever it might be. But hopefully we can, from an academic and research point of view, all get together and work together.
Yeah, rather than reinventing the wheel and having a bunch of wheels laying around for us to trip over. That's exactly right.
It'd be fantastic if your university, and I know ECU is probably not gonna step up. Not sure about the University of Newcastle, Sam, but I really feel like a prominent university needs to step into this void and set up a centre of research excellence and have have a certificate or something that's part of that, because I think the delivery of it through a tertiary organisation would give it a lot more credibility, and it will also help join it up with the credentialing with the various professions.
Great. Pixie?
Yeah, I think this is something that is really important. And when I first wanted to go into 2 different bachelors, or like rather than a standard double degree, I remember my course coordinator saying that people don't really do this. They either study the body or the mind. And I'm like, well, you really need to understand how the 2 of those are interplaying. So I want to do both. And they said yes. But then you've got social work. Sociology is actually critical to psychedelic therapy, because you're not just dealing with like a person as an island. There's all of the people that they're connected to, their job, their family, all of those kinds of dynamics are a large part of what's going on for a person. Like, there's so many different facets to this, and to really get it right, we do need those different disciplines communicating, and to really not only understand how these treatments are working well, why they don't work for a subset, but also to be able to really unpack what conditions that they work for, what is the best practice models, all of those kinds of things. It really can't just be down to psychiatrists or just psychologists alone. And even like neuroscience is interesting, but it's still only a part of the story.
Yeah, I agree. Who's starting this centre? Quick, I want to attend. It sounds fun. Okay, so I think this next one is a bit more of a statement than a question. Thanks, Sam, for lighting me up with the nice purple. Well done. So are they going to try psychotherapy, the therapy on those who have had no success with conventional therapy, then say psychedelics don't work when they can't undo the damage done by SSRIs? Did that question come out good?
That's a loaded question. That is a really loaded question. I'm just going to throw that out there. And so when we take away the kind of emotional reactivity, I think we're going to find some people will still prefer one, some people will still prefer another, some people will respond well to one, some people will respond well to another. Or like, my professor's focused a lot on exercise for depression. There is actually a lot of different treatment models out there, and you don't even just have to stick with one. So yeah, I think that's really important to keep in mind as well. I don't think it's going to be a this or that, one or the other kind of game.
Yeah, that's right. Just like there's a variety of different antidepressants, there's the different modalities of therapy. Some work, some don't. Yeah, that's exactly right. Okay, what does the panel think of, this is kind of similar to the other question actually, what does the panel think as psilocybin as a preventative for depression in people who aren't yet in the major depressive stage? I think Nigel was touching on the fact that it would be better to catch it before they got so depressed that they can't do anything else.
Yeah, I don't think we would use psilocybin as a preventative measure, but certainly if people are having life challenges and distress on a mild level, I think psilocybin can be very helpful for certain people. So I think I feel really restricted having to treat people with treatment-resistant depression. I think it'd be great if we could just treat people who had depression. And depression is such a broad term. What does it mean? You know, we threw the DSM out the window ages ago, but we still have to use it. We have to go out in the garden and find it, because that's what we've got to do. But really, depression can mean anything. And I think psilocybin can help people, you know, the worried well, that old term, through to life challenges, through to creative challenges. It has a great role to play in a whole lot of systems.
I think this is one of the limitations of the medical model. And you know, what we're talking about tonight is the implementation of this within the medical model. And, you know, Pixie was talking before about one of the reasons people will continue to access underground therapies is consumer preference. And I think people should have choice. I think people should have options. And if they want to treat their, you know, if they want to prevent depression with microdosing psilocybin, I think they should be able to. That doesn't fit within the medical model, though. And so I think that goes back to, you know, the idea of things like decriminalization, because that will then allow people to have more choices and not to be a criminal in making those choices.
Yeah, and not busying too much up our medical industry, our medical system as well. Would you give, say this is just example, but say you were treating someone with treatment-resistant depression and somebody with mild presenting depression, would you give them a different dose? Would you give them a larger dose for the more treatment-resistant and a lower one for?
No. Well, yes. The answer, yes, of course. And, you know, psycholytic therapy, which was practiced in the 60s and 70s, they used to use lower doses, and people wouldn't go into such an intense or deep state, and they were more aware of what was going on. And then under certain circumstances, they get a bigger hit. So again, the dosage, which we're pretty restricted in at the moment with our research, is flexible. Although what we're finding is that the psilocybin is not weight dependent. So you can give the same dose to a little person as you can to a big person and have the same effect.
Yes, yeah. This is true. Okay, so we've only got about 15 minutes left. I might do a couple more questions. Let's see here.
Questions are great.
There's a lot of good ones in here, and I'm just like,
yeah.
Just as Antonika's going through looking for the next question, but the question that brought up the loaded question with the SSRIs just reminded me that you know, we were talking about the issues with accessibility earlier on, and one of the reasons people can't enter clinical trials at the moment is because they're taking an SSRI medication, so they have to be titrated off that medication. And certainly in our MDMA trial, we found it incredibly difficult for people to come off that SSRI medication. And there's other reasons why people can't participate: medical comorbidities, psychiatric comorbidities. And just because this is being made, you know, something that's outside of clinical trials, those exclusion criteria don't get thrown out the window. The authorized prescribers are still going to have to look at those potential contraindications. And so that's another issue in terms of accessibility as well, that I don't think has been sold well, hasn't been communicated well in the media. You know, that wow, yay, there's all these new treatments that are going to be available, but the people are still going to be limited in being able to access them with the same issues that they're experiencing accessing them in clinical trials.
Exactly. So do we think that this rescheduling will further open up research into production of other psychedelics?
I think that there's definitely going to be scaffolding when this has had a bit of time to settle and we see how it goes. But in saying that, I mean, unless something goes catastrophically wrong with this rollout, that is inevitable that they'll start to look at more conditions for those medicines, but it will also start to soften the perception, and the whole war on drugs facade is going to be completely shattered by that point. So it will make it easier to then start looking at some of those other ones. In saying that, there are ones that have a lot of back history, like LSD. There's already a lot of misconceptions that people hold around that, and so sometimes it can affect the experience. And that can be a bit of an issue. But there is, and actually we've also got Ibogaine, by the way, in Australia, that was already rescheduled years ago that no one really seems to talk about. Yeah, I know.
I was not aware.
Yeah, but there is definitely some. Ketamine is another one. So we've already got, cannabis, ketamine. We've got a few things out there already. We've actually got Xyrem for sleep disorders. I definitely think we're going to continue going in this direction because there's too much interest, and considering how fewer breakthroughs that we've had in psychiatry in the last few decades, they can't not at this point.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Pixie. So, all right, next question. I liked this question. What if shrooms teach you that you aren't sick and that your depression and anxiety is a perfectly normal reaction to a sick world? Maybe billionaires, politicians, and capitalists need the therapy more. I liked that one. It was a good one. Thank you, Andrew. Oh, no, that was Space. How many people use these substances recreationally and improve their lives forever and don't even get hurt? A lot of us. There's a lot. The guy down the street, someone's nana. The guy who sold me this house was like, he researched me on the internet, and then he was like, I need to talk to you about something. So everybody, it seems, has tried these substances at some point and have a lot of benefit from. Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
Yeah, look, it's a lot. Like I mean, maybe not everyone, but like the last national household drug survey, I think it was in 2019, 1.6% of people surveyed had used a psychedelic in the past 12 months. And I think it was about 11% of people had used a psychedelic at least once in their lifetime. And that was in 2019. And I mean, I don't know what I don't know what it's going to be like the next set of figures, but if I had to make a wild guess, I'd say the upward trend would continue. So, maybe it's not everyone, but you have to think on average, every, 1 in 10 people have used psychedelics at least once. And over more than 1 in 100 have used it, in the last year. So it is a lot. And clearly, we're not hearing from 10% of the population. We're not even hearing of 1% of the population. So yes, the answer to that is yes. A lot of people, whether it changes how it changes their life for the better, whether or not it does. But also to backtrack, and I missed answering this question because I was digging around for a reference that I was trying to remember, was that it could be beneficial. It's hard, but research has been done looking at kind of large populations of people who in surveys say that, yes, I have used psilocybin in my lifetime, or yes, I've used LSD in my lifetime. And there are, some research does indicate that there are certain kind of mental health correlations that go along with those. I'm reluctant to attribute cause because of the kind of research they are. I don't think you can necessarily say that having taken LSD in your lifetime caused you to be less likely to have committed domestic violence towards your partner, but the correlations seems to be there. So maybe in some research, there's in some papers there seems to be this kind of idea that maybe just having used psychedelics at all can correlate with certain positive outcomes. But as I said, I wouldn't attribute cause to it. That just kind of remains to be seen.
And it's worth mentioning that not everybody that takes a psychedelic has a positive experience. And I mean, I often see the pointy end. So, people that do have really bad experiences, so much so that it actually can cause mental health issues. And it really is the minority. And in my experience, it's often due to comorbid psychiatric conditions, inappropriate settings. So there's a range of things we can do to prevent that, but it does happen, albeit rare.
Yeah, which is why harm reduction is so important. Eternity, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was essentially just going to add on to what Steve said, is that we need to acknowledge people are going to use these medicines in underground, and there's going to be positive and negative experience. And for those people who feel like they might be at the end of the road and the clinical trial pathway is too far away, people are going to use these substances and medicines. So I think what we need to do is just make sure that people have their integration sessions booked in, because it's difficult to predict what kind of experience that one may have. It may be positive, it may be negative. It's certainly mind altering, and it could be belief restructure somebody's beliefs the next day. And so, yeah, I would just urge those who are considering using psychedelics and maybe haven't done them before to do them in a safe setting. Look into harm reduction, have a look at the APS website, and of course book in your integration sessions as well. And there are some excellent underground therapists, and for anyone who's seen Four Corners last year, there are some dangerous facilitators out there, and so I would urge people to do their research before they embark on any sort of underground experience.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Well said, Eternity. Thank you very much for adding that. We are winding up. We have 5 minutes left. I'm going to ask one more question because I feel like this is an important question that hasn't been covered tonight, and I'm hoping someone here in the panel can answer it for me. Are there any conversations happening with traditional owners about honouring Australian plant medicines and working collaboratively to provide trials for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? Is anyone aware of any trials going on for this?
Because I'm thinking off the cuff here. I can't remember the organisation's name. So if somebody remembers the name, please throw it out there. But there's the group that are looking at developing an ayahuasca medicine through University of Melbourne. Dan Jerome. And I know they're looking at ways of reciprocating back to Indigenous communities, particularly because, you know, they're extracting DMT from acacia.
Cool. Well, yes. So yes, there is some things happening in the space, and definitely check that out. You can probably Google that, right, Steve?
Psyche.
Yes. Well done. It came back.
I just want to add another comment, if I may, Antonika, before you wrap up. So I'm seeing some comments come through in the chat here, and I just want to go back to the harm reduction point here. For those who are considering having an underground psychedelic experience, I just urge you to be really cautious of people who say things like they're going to bring the light in to heal your shadow, people who don't have first aid training, toilets, basic things like that. And I just want to reiterate for anyone who's wondering, you absolutely cannot give sexual consent while you're under the influence of any psychedelic medicine. So I'll just throw that out there as well, because for anyone who's been observing this space, there have been people who've been harmed in this space. And as I've mentioned a number of times tonight, safety needs to be at the forefront of our minds. And so if you I mean, we all hear a lot of things in this space. If you have any concerns whatsoever, if in doubt, sit it out. That's what I like to say. So
it's a good one. I like that one.
If in doubt, sit it out.
Yeah.
I think it's actually important too, though, that with the above ground ones as well, you actually do your research and look at their reviews, because sexual misconduct is a problem within the medical community as well. It's a problem for psychologists. Actually, it's quite a well-known problem that we have to discuss quite a lot about in undergrad for counselling, psychology, psychiatry. But, you know, do your research, because you're in a very vulnerable state. It's not like you're just going in to see a therapist like you normally would. And also those kinds of really happy, warm, fuzzy feelings mean your inhibition is down. So, like, really, really need to think about and research into who you're sitting with, regardless of whether they're registered or not.
And that's why we need to do the research and maintain standards. If we let those standards down by not doing research, that's more like things will go wrong, much more likely. So we've got to be very careful with that, I think.
Yeah, and in the underground scene, there's this real attitude around it's okay to date clients, which is also deeply concerning.
Yes, this is something that's been popping up.
I think. Yeah, I just wanted to finish up by saying, we go back to the 60s, there were two guys who worked at Harvard. One of them was Timothy Leary and one of them was Ramdas. Look what happened to Timothy Leary and look what happened to Ramdas. And they're the sort of options that we've got now. We're facing those sorts of options. Things can go awfully wrong or things can go quite well. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, guys. Fantastic panel. Can I please ask each panel member that if they had a single message for the TGA around this change, what would it be? How about you go first, Eternity?
Oh, gosh. I'd really like some time to think on that one. So if anyone else would like to go first.
Well, I'd just like them to slow down and talk to psychiatrists who are doing the work. The problem at the moment is that we've got psychiatrists who aren't doing the work, making the decisions. Come and talk to us, the people on the ground. It's so important.
Yeah, well said,
Well said, Nigel.
Yeah, I think Nigel makes a good point, and I'd just extend that. I would urge the TGA to speak with people that have knowledge and experience in this area. People like Nigel and psychiatrists, also psychologists that, like myself, working in the area, but also the broader community. You know, people within the APS, people from the underground. You know, people involved with Patch. It would be good to see a really broad consultation process. I've been following TGA decisions for about 20 years. I've never seen something like this where it's been an about turn, 180 position change with no warning and no real implementation time. So, you know, where I have seen the TGA say no and then make a change to say yes, it's usually involved significant community consultation, and I feel like that step has been missed on this occasion.
Agreed. Sam or Pixie, what's your main message for the TGA around this change? Can you top those?
Well, I think that it's really important for the TGA to consider that as they've made this decision, that there is going to be even more interest, even more attention, and that even more people are going to be doing this with or without it being through approved channels. And that if we don't start to look at, even when addiction arises, not to say that these substances are addictive, but even when drugs are misused, it is a health condition, not a legal one. And the sooner that we get on with addressing it as a health issue and refunneling the money that is spent on law enforcement into helping people with addiction issues and into being able to study psychedelics properly, we're always going to have an underground market where people are getting hurt.
Well said, Pix.
Yeah, look, I'm not sure what to add to that. I think, look, it's I mean, a lot of like my messages that I would like to send probably aren't for the TGA, because they're not directly responsible for a lot of the things that we need to fix. But they do play a role in you know, prohibition. TGA plays a role in the war on drugs, and you know, that's what they know it. We all know it. But I think it would be, to consult with people, like other people have said, to consult with people who have lived experience of using these substances. It's crazy to me that I would have more lived experience of some of these substances than just some, you know, random psychiatrist. No offense to psychiatrists, you know, but you know, I mean, my experience doesn't qualify me to prescribe them, but I shouldn't be having more experience of these things than someone who's prescribing them to really vulnerable people in a really, you know, sort of a setting where everything has to be, you know, right. So it's it's to consult with people who are actually familiar with lived experience of these substances and all of the things that go around them, I think is essential.
Yeah, and I would agree with what everyone has said. And just to build on that as well, it would be wonderful if the TGA was just that little bit more accessible, if there were regular community consultations with the broader community, but of course the psychiatrists and psychologists and other therapists and people working in this space, so that it is a collaborative, evidence-led, results-driven approach.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing a little bit of yourselves with us tonight, panel. So I just had a blank because it's nighttime and I'm tired now.
Can I just add in there, Anthony? You've done amazing. Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to say thank you so much. You've done an amazing job hosting tonight.
Thanks.
A really wonderful experience. I'm sure for everybody else on the panel. So thank you so much. And
thanks.
I look forward to the next one with if there's any future updates, if the TGA makes any other surprise.
Hopefully they don't, or maybe, who knows. I just want to really thank everyone who sent in their questions. There were a lot of questions and obviously we could not answer them all. I think there's like 25, 30 questions there. So thank you so much for showing up and being part of our community and showing up tonight to show your support. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, our monthly newsletter over on our website. And while you're there, check out all of our social media channels. And finally, thank you to our partner organisation, Prisons at Prism, EGA, Patch, Enlightened Mental Health, and the participants and the watchers for giving us the opportunity to shed some light on this very important topic. And we'll see you guys maybe the next time something magic happens.
Thanks
so much, guys. And thanks everyone at home watching.
Thank you.